September 12, 1941. Warsaw, Poland. The city breathed smoke and sorrow. Streets were carved with rubble, the skeletal remains of buildings still smoldering from weeks of bombing raids. Children ran barefoot through alleys littered with splintered wood and shards of glass, their laughter an uneasy echo in a world that no longer made sense. Amid the devastation, the libraries stood, half-shattered, their shelves leaning dangerously, but still holding the fragile weight of ink and paper. For many, these were relics of a time that seemed impossibly distant, but for others, they were weapons, waiting quietly for a mind sharp enough to wield them. Inside one such library, a lone figure moved with meticulous precision. She was small, barely reaching the top of the shelves, her coat threadbare and her shoes caked with mud. Her hands trembled slightly as she ran them along the spines of books that had survived the raids, noting titles that were now forbidden, names that could get a reader executed. Each book was a battlefield, each page a potential crime. Yet she did not hesitate. There was urgency in her movements, a silent recklessness born of desperation. She was a librarian, and in the chaos of war, she had discovered a weapon invisible to the soldiers patrolling the streets. It started with a pattern she had almost overlooked. Tiny symbols, scribbled in margins with pencil or ink, seemingly meaningless. Notes left by readers who had long since vanished. At first, she thought it was idle doodling, an attempt to preserve sanity in a world gone mad. But then she began to notice repetitions, sequences of letters, numbers, the way a dash here or there could alter the meaning entirely. It was subtle, clever, almost innocent. Yet beneath it, there was intelligence, strategy, a message waiting to be read. The paradox struck her with a cold thrill. How could something so fragile, so overlooked, carry the power to fight an army? She began to map the notes, using scraps of paper she stole from the offices of the local council. Each margin, each annotation, became a node in a growing web of information. Troop movements, ration shortages, safe houses. The information was fragmented, scattered across dozens of volumes, but it was enough. Enough to give civilians a chance. Enough to give resistance fighters a whisper of what the occupying forces planned. The city itself became a labyrinth of secrets, hidden in plain sight. And she, the quiet guardian of ink and paper, became its unlikely conductor. She could hear the distant thrum of boots on cobblestones, the occasional bark of German officers shouting orders. Each sound was a reminder that she was alone, that discovery could mean death. And yet, fear did not paralyze her. It sharpened her senses. Each creak of the floorboard, each flutter of pages in the wind, became a warning, a rhythm she learned to follow. The library smelled of smoke, mildew, and the faint bitterness of chalk dust, a smell she now associated with life and death alike. Here, she understood, knowledge itself was dangerous. The very act of reading had become an act of rebellion. Her first coded message was delivered almost by accident. A young girl, barely 15, had approached her earlier that morning, asking for a book on herbal remedies. Inside the margins, scrawled in pencil, was a note. Warehouse on Dobra Street, 10 p.m. Supplies moved. The librarian's heart had skipped a beat. She knew this could not be coincidence. The note was precise, actionable, and invisible to anyone who did not know to look. She memorized it, committing every detail to memory, and sent the girl back with a message of her own, disguised as an innocuous question about the book. That night, she watched from a window as a small group arrived at the warehouse, moving under the cover of darkness, guided only by words written in the margins of a book no one would suspect. It was intoxicating. She realized then that the very thing the occupiers sought to destroy, the flow of knowledge, the written word, could be turned against them. Teenagers, clerks, and the elderly, people dismissed as powerless, could now wield information like a weapon. It was a contradiction that seemed almost absurd. Pencil marks on paper outsmarting soldiers with guns, ink defeating armor. And yet it was real. Each success emboldened her. each small victory proving that even in a world dominated by brute force, intellect and subtlety could endure. But with power came peril. She knew the Gestapo were everywhere, their eyes behind every corner. One wrong glance, one missed detail, could end not only her life, but the lives of those she had unknowingly drawn into her web. The coded notes had to be subtle, woven into the text in ways that appeared meaningless, but readable to those who understood the pattern. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience, intuition, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. Each day, she pored over the margins, connecting the dots, translating doodles into strategies, whispers into warnings. Every pencil stroke mattered. Every erased mark was a potential tragedy narrowly avoided. And yet, amidst the tension, there were moments of humanity. A forgotten note in a book on poetry revealed a soldier's longing for home. A mother's frantic scribble warned of ration cuts. A young boy's sketches of animals hid coordinates to a supply cache. In the margins, the lives of Warsaw's citizens were recorded, fragile and fleeting, yet charged with defiance. The librarian read them all, feeling the pulse of the city through graphite and ink, sensing both despair and hope intertwined in the smallest of gestures. By nightfall, the library was quiet except for the rustle of pages and the occasional scratching of her pencil. She leaned against a shelf, exhausted, her eyes scanning the lines of text that had become a map of resistance. She knew she had only scratched the surface. The city was larger than any single person could map, more dangerous than any single mind could anticipate. But the pattern was there, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to be used. And she understood, in a quiet, visceral way, that knowledge, the seemingly powerless, silent act of reading and writing, could become the sharpest weapon of all. The paradox of it stayed with her as she stepped into the darkened streets. Ordinary objects, ordinary people, and ordinary notes were rewriting the rules of war. She had discovered a secret that could change lives. Yet its success depended on invisibility, on being uncelebrated, unnoticed. And as the wind carried the faint smell of smoke and ash through the city, she wondered how many victories would go unrecorded, how many heroes would vanish simply because they operated in silence, and the world only remembered the loud and the brutal. The first chapter of her story, she realized, had only just begun. Somewhere in the margins of Warsaw's ruined books, the fight for survival had already taken root. And she, a librarian with a pencil and an eye for detail, held the first thread. One thread in a web that, if unraveled correctly, could shift the balance of power, rewrite the fate of the city, and defy the occupiers who believed everything could be controlled. The shadows deepened as she walked home, carrying a stack of books pressed to her chest. Each book contained lives, plans, secrets, and resistance. The city was watching, listening, waiting, and she, a single woman among millions, had discovered that in the quiet, in the overlooked, in the margins of history itself, war could be challenged, not with guns, but with the delicate, cunning stroke of a pencil. March 3rd, 1942. Warsaw, hidden beneath the shadow of occupation. The city had grown quieter, the streets eerily obedient under the gaze of German patrols. Windows were shuttered, voices hushed, and even children seemed to tread lightly, as if the ground itself might betray them. Yet within this oppressive silence, a different kind of noise was building, a rhythm of ink on paper, whispered instructions, and footsteps moving with purpose through back alleys. The librarian had realized that discovery alone was not enough. The coded margins needed hands to carry them, minds to interpret them, and courage to act when the night was full of danger. It began in the library itself. She called upon those who had been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated. A janitor with arthritis who could memorize the positions of every book. A teenager whose small frame allowed him to slip unnoticed past checkpoints. Clerks who spent their days buried in ledgers, perfecting their skills in patience and attention to detail. They were ordinary people, the kind the occupiers never worried about. But here, in this clandestine network, ordinariness was power. Each was assigned a task according to skill, memorizing notes, delivering messages, observing enemy patterns, or decoding the subtle signals hidden in margins. She taught them how to read between lines that seemed empty, to recognize sequences of dots, dashes, and scribbles, each representing critical intelligence. "You do not just read," she told them, voice low, eyes bright with conviction. "You interpret. You translate. Every mark could mean life or death. Do not forget that." The paradox was almost cruel. Teenagers and janitors, untrained in strategy or military discipline, now became key operatives in a resistance network that generals had failed to protect. Yet they accepted the responsibility without hesitation, their courage fueled by necessity and the unspoken knowledge that failure was not an option. Their first mission together was a test of both wit and nerves. A shipment of ration supplies, quietly redirected to a Gestapo-controlled warehouse, had to be intercepted. The librarian handed a tiny, tattered book to a boy named Tomasz, no older than 16. Inside, margin notes spelled out the location and timing. Tomasz's hands shook, but he clenched the book to his chest and slipped into the night. The streets were silent, except for the distant march of boots and the occasional bark of a guard's voice. Every shadow was a potential threat, every window a possible witness. And yet, Tomasz moved with deliberate precision, guided entirely by ink that no one else understood. Back in the library, the librarian paced among the shelves, listening to the soft scrape of pencil on paper as her recruits prepared more messages. Each annotation was a lifeline, each delivery a gamble. The city had become a chessboard, and these ordinary people, armed only with books and courage, were learning to anticipate moves, protect pieces, and strike when the time was right. The paradox became clearer with every successful operation. The enemy, with guns and authority, could be outmaneuvered by pencils, marginalia, and quiet observation. Intelligence, subtle and invisible, was proving deadlier than brute force. The network grew quickly. Students who had once spent afternoons doodling in textbooks now scouted patrol patterns, delivering coded messages through flower pots, laundry lines, and bakery deliveries. Clerks memorized ration schedules, predicting shortages that could cripple the occupier's logistics. The janitor, once dismissed for his age, became a master of misdirection, placing books in precise locations so that notes could be retrieved without alerting anyone. Every person, every gesture, every quiet decision compounded into a system that the Germans could not see and could not anticipate. Yet fear remained constant, gnawing at the edges of their resolve. One night, a Gestapo patrol caught sight of a teenager loitering near the library. The boy froze, heart pounding, eyes wide, book clutched to his chest. For a moment, it seemed as if months of careful planning would unravel in a heartbeat. But the patrol moved on, distracted by a barking dog. The teenager exhaled, trembling, and slipped back inside. The librarian, waiting in shadow, felt a surge of both relief and anger. Relief that no lives were lost, anger that the city's children were being forced to navigate a war like soldiers. And yet, she could not stop. The stakes were too high, the lives too fragile, and the network too vital. The coded messages did more than save supplies or warn of troop movements. They revealed human truths hidden under the weight of occupation. In one book on botany, a note warned of a planned raid on a small orphanage. In another, a mother had annotated a diary with instructions for hiding food, using poetic lines that disguised the urgency. Each annotation carried both practical intelligence and fragments of personal fear, hope, and love. The librarian saw it all, feeling the pulse of the city through these scribbled margins, understanding that resistance was as much about preserving humanity as it was about survival. As weeks turned into months, the network became a lifeline. Messages passed seamlessly from hand to hand, each person acting with silent understanding of the risks involved. They learned to anticipate each other's movements, developing a rhythm that was almost imperceptible to outsiders. The paradox deepened. The occupiers who believed Warsaw under control were being undone by its most unassuming citizens. And yet, despite their successes, there was a constant hum of anxiety. Every operation was temporary, every victory fragile. Discovery by the Gestapo would erase everything in an instant. One night, after delivering a particularly complex message involving a hidden cache of medical supplies, Tomasz returned to the library, breathless, eyes wide. "They're watching," he whispered. The librarian nodded, sensing the same tension she had felt countless times. But she did not falter. She had trained them for this, had instilled in them the understanding that courage was measured not by fearlessness, but by perseverance despite fear. The room, filled with the quiet rustle of pages and low murmurs, became a theater of human resilience, where ordinary people carried extraordinary responsibility. By the end of the day, the librarian sat alone, reviewing the margins of a newly returned book. Each annotation was a testament to human ingenuity and bravery under pressure. The lines of code, the symbols, the subtle marks, all were proof that resistance did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, scribbled in pencil, and relied on faith in the ordinary. Yet even in these moments of quiet triumph, she knew the city's survival was never guaranteed. One wrong turn, one overlooked mark, and the delicate web could collapse entirely. And as she closed the book, the librarian's thoughts lingered on the paradox that had defined her work. Those who seemed powerless were the city's greatest defenders. Teenagers with chalk, clerks with ledger skills, and a janitor with a memory sharp as steel. These were the people rewriting the rules of war. The human solution had been found not in generals, strategies, or weapons, but in ordinary minds rising to extraordinary demands. Yet she also knew the truth. The world outside these walls would never know their names. Their acts of courage were invisible to history, their victories erased by time, yet no less vital for it. In the darkness of the library, she traced a line of pencil across a margin and paused. Somewhere, a delivery was being made, a warning heeded, a life saved. The network pulsed silently, invisibly, like a heartbeat beneath the city's rubble. And she understood, with a mix of pride and quiet sorrow, that they were changing the course of events with nothing but ink, courage, and trust. Warsaw might be occupied, its streets patrolled by soldiers, but within these walls, a resistance had taken shape, defined by ordinary hands performing acts of extraordinary bravery. And still, the question lingered, heavy and persistent. How long could silence sustain a revolution? How long could invisible heroes outweed an enemy that saw only the surface? Each day, each scribble, each careful delivery was a gamble with life itself. But the librarian, watching her recruits leave into the night, felt a fragile hope. They were small, overlooked, underestimated, but they were not powerless. And sometimes she thought being invisible was the greatest strength of all. July 15th, 1945. Warsaw, liberated but scarred. The city wore its wounds openly. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets still littered with rubble, and the air heavy with the scent of smoke and damp earth. Yet amidst the destruction, life had begun to pulse again, slow but insistent. Citizens emerged from hidden corners, tentatively reclaiming streets, markets, and homes that had been lost to fear. Amid the ruins, the librarian returned to the shell of the library she had once navigated as a battlefield of ink and paper. Its shelves, half collapsed and blackened, still held the fragile bones of knowledge, the remnants of a war fought silently within margins and annotations. She walked among them with a mixture of reverence and grief, touching pages as if remembering lost friends. The network she had built over years, the students, clerks, janitors, and teenagers, had survived, and through their courage countless lives had been spared. She remembered Tomasz, now barely a shadow of the nervous boy who had first carried a book through the city streets. She thought of Anna, who had delivered coded messages with a steadfastness that defied her frail frame, and the janitor, who had outwitted patrols simply by knowing the floorboards and hidden corners of the city better than anyone else. They had been invisible, uncelebrated, yet indispensable. The paradox remained striking. The very people Warsaw had overlooked, underestimated, or ignored were the ones who had shaped the course of events in ways generals and armies could not. Yet victory was bittersweet. The world outside the city's rubble knew only of bombs, battles, and troop movements. History would record grand strategies, heroic generals, and decisive confrontations, but it would remain silent on the margins of books, on pencil marks that had redirected convoys, saved orphanages, and warned families. The librarian stood among the debris, holding a diary open to a page filled with tiny, almost imperceptible notations. Each line, each mark, had been a life saved or a tragedy averted. Yet she knew that these victories would not appear in official records. Their triumph had been intentionally quiet, a whisper in the chaos of war, invisible to those who demanded spectacle to validate heroism. She began to sort through the remnants, piecing together the operations of the network. Notes and books about botany, poetry, and chemistry formed a map of the city's resistance. Messages had traveled through the most unremarkable channels. A stack of textbooks delivered to a neighbor, a ledger handed to a clerk, a sketchbook passed under the nose of a patrolling officer. Every successful delivery had been a defiance of the occupiers' control. And yet, the librarian knew that these victories were ephemeral in the eyes of the world. They existed only in memory, in margins, in the minds of the people who had lived them. A city's salvation could vanish as easily as smoke.